afternoon, City of Rochester folks. We're really excited to have you join us today for the second episode of our Equity Alliance Equity Series. For those of you who have not been a part of this before, the Equity Alliance has a very specific purpose, and that is to accelerate equitable change in our own community, making sure that we're impacting disparities through reparations, restoration, reformation, and based on really radical collaboration. Radical because we're bringing together private and public partners, folks who probably have never worked together before, because we understand that equitable change has to be systemic, and the system involves all of us. So really happy that you have joined us today and that you continue to do so. When we're thinking about our initiatives as the Equity Alliance, the first priority is co-design, making sure that we are involving community members that have historically not been engaged and participated in decision-making in our community. Second is coalition building. So again, bringing folks like all of you who are here today together in a space that allows us to learn and work. And then thirdly, and maybe very importantly, I would say, thinking about equitable policy transformation and improvement, changing both internal and public policy. And then as we're thinking about, the alliance itself, currently City of Rochester and DMC have a joint alliance, but it is open to anyone or any organization that would like to participate. So if you have an interest in participating in the Equity Alliance, joining it, you can certainly contact me or Wafa El Khalifa, who is my partner in this project. But for today, we're just really, really excited and happy to spill the tea. Best title that I've seen, very interesting. And we're thinking about how transformative equity analysis can unveil critical insights and elevate organizational efficacy. So we're joined by Amanda Florence Garcia and Laura Abarella, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them, although there's much more to both of those individuals than I can probably read this morning. So Amanda is a dedicated educator operating from a cultural humility framework to center and elevate historically marginalized voices, promote belonging and mattering, disrupt structural inequities, and advance intersectional and social justice, right? She is currently the CEO and founder of Goodenough Consulting and a team lead and partner for Social Responsibility Speaks. So if you want to use an emoji to welcome her, clap, smile, whatever you want to do, please do that to welcome Amanda. And then Laura is a facilitator and consultant, drawing from her professional, educational, and lived experiences as a community organizer and teacher. Laura has undergraduate teaching experience in the area of race, gender, and sexuality studies. She has experience with organizational harm and response intervention, as well as community organizing, political education, and arts-based student leadership and programming. So again, use an emoji, whatever you'd like to welcome her. I also encourage everyone, as you're reading through kind of this small excerpt of today, is to go ahead in the chat and say hello, put your name in, what organization you're affiliated with, what you're hoping to learn, and perhaps how you're surviving the heat today or what you're doing to push through the extreme heat today. And with that, I just want to welcome Amanda and Laura, and looking forward to a really robust learning engagement. And someone will be monitoring the chat. So as you have questions, feel free to just include them there. And thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone who is joining us. We know time is precious, and so we appreciate you spending this hour with us. We also appreciate the names and entities you're associated with in the chat, so we'll be definitely keeping an eye on that as we move forward. So just want to do a tech check, make sure my screen sharing is coming through okay. Perfect. All right, then we will jump in. So you heard a little bit about us already. Just wanted to share a little bit more. Again, my name is Amanda Florence Garcia Goodenough. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm joining you from the La Crosse area of Wisconsin, where we occupy the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Laura and I are educators, consultants, coaches, and mostly learners, I would say. You might often find us rejecting the concept of titles, although they can mean everything and nothing at the same time, but mostly we reject the title of experts. And that's not to say that everybody should, but as we are doing this work, we don't always claim to be experts. And so wanted to name that. Instead, we we like to share that we lean on a combined 25 years of career experience across industries of higher education, law, community organizing, and student programming, some of what you heard. But we honor even more the experience of being a fellow traveler on our collective journey toward a more equitable and just workplace and world. So as consultants and coaches, we have supported many different clients move along this journey from corporate America, like Microsoft, to small nonprofits within this area of Wisconsin and Minnesota, governmental agencies, colleges and universities, to fraternity, sorority headquarters, K-12 schools, and more. I think one of the really great things about diversity, equity, inclusion is that it is everywhere, right? Like this matters across every industry. And so while it can be really helpful to have people within industry speak to these things, there also is this idea that these things are systemic and they often show up very similarly across. While we don't know every organization and industry intimately, and we absolutely own that, there are also lots of things that are applicable across whatever you do. Like if you work with people, I always say this conversation matters and is relevant. So we come here today to share some of what we've observed and learned along our journey, and especially in the capacity of consultants, and particularly in some of our interest areas. So mine include hate bias prevention, response, and healing efforts, student activism and employee activism, climate and culture shifting, like organizational climate, organizational culture shifting practices, and bold leadership, just to name a few. And I want to invite Laura in to just share a little bit more about herself, and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Abelera. I'm good with she and they pronouns, just echoing some of Amanda's experience, but wanted to add on a little bit. So my professional background is in higher education, teaching, community organizing, and youth advocacy programming. Really excited to see the variety of organizations represented, library, children's museums, exciting to see how many different aspects of the community are present in a session like this. That makes me excited for your area. I have spent most of my professional career either working with Amanda or in the nonprofit sector, and have loved getting to support organizations in their equity work, pulling from both my own experience and seeing where connections can be made regionally and nationally. It's so wonderful to get to see the connections that form and help be weavers and connectors so that groups that are doing great work can continue to build capacity and power with one another in this region, and then again also nationally, both to keep momentum and establish really sustainable DEI and equity goals. So that's, again, another reason why I'm excited to see so many different varieties of roles and organizations in a space, because oftentimes it can be, lonely when we don't know where each other are and how we can be replicating the things that are working really well and sharing that knowledge and expertise. So I'm also really passionate about grassroots organizing and reimagining ways to engage in community care to realize public safety. Also very passionate about civic engagement, very involved in getting people excited about and engaged in our local government, where in the area where Amanda and I are near La Crosse, especially our incredible young people. So Gen Z and Gen Alpha, already improving our world in such beautiful ways. And so love working with youth and young people and kids in that capacity. Also, just a reminder to throw any questions in the chat that you have, either directly to us or for everyone else to see too, because oftentimes we all have the same questions. We may not have time for Q&A, but want to know what's on your mind, and feel free to follow up with us afterwards if you would like to. We would love to connect with, as many of you as possible. And with that, just wanted to share a quick roadmap of what our plan is for today. Want to talk a little bit about the benefits of external DEI consultation, give you a little peek into our philosophy of support. That includes a quick introduction to cultural humility, which is a big foundational component to how we engage in work and collaboration and support for organizations. explain why we would encourage folks to engage with transformative equity analysis, and then share a little bit about what that can look like when you elicit that type of organizational support, giving examples of how different organizations that we've worked with have utilized and creatively leveraged our collaboration, and then give a few successes and strong partnership stories that might be helpful, so people can kind of imagine what that could look like. Also wanted to share that this type of support and partnership can look so many different ways and has, which is super exciting, and also gives us the ability to tailor things specifically to organizations, and what the needs are, because every space is so different culturally and structurally, that these can be short-term partnerships. So we could come in and help with a rebranding process, and you can have people supporting you in that way for a few months, or it can look long-term. Maybe you're partnering with consultants for 3 years to engage in both a transformative equity analysis and then building out education for your entire organization based on what is found in some of and implementing some new policies and getting external support with that too. So gonna kick it over to Amanda to get us going.
Thank you. So we wanted to start out by setting the stage for external DEI consultation, broadly speaking. There are many reasons why organizations might look outward for support with their justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, access, mattering, all the things, with all these efforts, which is totally okay and often absolutely necessary to ask for help. Of course, you want to also be building that internal infrastructure to sustain DEI work. But sometimes people might reach out to external folks because key stakeholders and decision makers in certain organizations might lack the knowledge and skill that is required to move this work forward. Maybe folks aren't fluent in DEI language. And so if we're lacking that, right, that could be a good reason to reach out. External consultants can also be more objective and honest, depending on the consultant, of course, but especially since they don't have to navigate relationships and internal politics in the same way that people within organizations might feel pressured to. There also, external consultants can bring like a 10,000-foot perspective, right? Or identify gaps that sometimes when you're looking like so closely at something and you're like not seeing it, being able to zoom out and look at things from another perspective can be really helpful, but can be hard when you're in the thick of it. Or even just bringing a different lens to look through, right? Whether that's based on identity or lived experience or specific scholarship. Also, trust is a big thing. And this can go both ways. Sometimes people don't trust outside people, right? Like, who are you? You don't know anything about our organization, and that can be fair and valid. But other times people might trust external consultants more. I know I have experienced that, right? Like sometimes people within organizations will ask, how are things going, or send out surveys. And there are lots of folks who don't feel safe to speak their truth for many reasons, right? I might be afraid of retaliation, or I want to give my boss this feedback, but I don't want to hurt their feelings, or whatever it may be. And so we found that sometimes it's easier to I'm going to keep it real with you because you're an outside external person and there's not as much at stake. So that can be a big thing. And then of course, time as well, right? So maybe you have all these things, the knowledge, skill, the trust and whatnot, but you don't have time. And so that could be another reason why, let's reach out to somebody who can give the time that this deserves to push things forward. The last thing I'll say, it isn't on here, but also just resources. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but these things take resources, right? And some of those resources are money. And so if you don't have the budget for this right now, but are working to build a budget, right, this could also be sometimes, depending on the scope of work, can be a lower expense, right? We can afford and invest in this for right now while we're waiting to build something bigger, either internally or whatnot. So if you plan to hire an external consultant to support some of these efforts, the one thing we want to say is you should probably try to, or maybe definitely is a better word, try to understand their philosophy and approach before entering into a partnership to make sure it is what you need. And so we're going to tell you a little bit about our Goodenough consulting philosophy as an example, not as a pitch to hire us, because we may not be your people, or we may not have capacity, but we want you to get an idea, a sense of how you might think to ask the right questions to try to understand the different styles or approaches that could be out there, the different worldviews that consultants might bring into a partnership. Because at the end of the day, it's just like whatever and whoever is going to help make things happen is going to help move things forward, right? And that might not be us, it might not be the next consultant. And so what is it that your organization needs, right? That is the ultimate goal. So a little bit about our philosophy as an example of things that you might want to be thinking about or asking. So because we are always trying to pay attention to how power is operating within organizations, we strive to center the people and communities most impacted by systemic harm. And so these are often people in most organizations who have great insights on some of your DEI struggles or shortcomings, people who can tell you the things that we might tell you, but sometimes organizations aren't listening to these folks for whatever reason, or again, they might not feel safe to speak their truth, or they're just not typically at the highest ranks of a hierarchical organization. They're not at the table. And so this is something that we feel very strongly about and we name upfront with a lot of our clients. And it reminds me of this quote. You might have seen this floating around the internet recently. But it says that if you find yourself on a committee discussing the needs of a particular group of people, but you look around the room and don't see anyone from that group, you should be highly skeptical of any, quote, conclusions reached, right? And so we see this happen all the time, right? Like we're at a school and we're really student-centered and we're making these decisions for students and no students are at the table. And so again, like who is it that is most impacted by harm, inequities, right? And how do we make sure that we are centering those voices? So as consultants, we try to identify and find those folks. We try to be in community with them, collaborate with them, when possible, amplify their voices, maybe even see like, do you want our support, right? When I was in an organization doing DEI work, it was really frustrating when when our organization would hire external consultants to say the same thing that I had been saying, right? And so it was like, you could hire the external consultant or you could just listen to me and to us. And so again, if we're coming in wanting to make sure we find these people who are probably already doing the work, and how do we make sure that we can be in community with them? We also ground our work in principles of cultural humility and transformative equity analysis. So we'll get to the T in a little bit, but cultural humility, I wanted to start by just providing a quick definition in case folks aren't familiar with cultural humility. Basically, and this is big, and I've spent a lot of time unpacking it. We don't have that time today. So in short, just know that is a framework that I believe can help us move toward our values, goals around equity and justice. And it incorporates a consistent commitment to learning and critical self-reflection, an intentional investment in mutually beneficial relationships, and the facilitation of healing-centered engagement while recognizing and redressing the role of power and privilege in a system. That's a lot. If you remember anything, just know that this is a practice. It is a state of mind, a state of being, and it is a constant journey. So one thing I want to at least mention before moving forward is this kind of chart comparison. So sometimes people are more familiar with cultural competence, and we're not necessarily advocating for one over the other. We think that there is room for both. There is value in both. In many ways, they complete each other, but there are differences. And so I wanted to highlight this main difference. And also, maybe as a note of caution, lots of folks like to just like jump into cultural competence without thinking about cultural humility. And that is a gap for lots of folks. So when we look at cultural competence, one of the goals under that idea typically is to build an understanding of others. And when we say others, this is usually our marginalized populations, our minoritized cultures, in order to improve our services. And so cultural competence values things like knowledge and training. So I've had many people ask, like, can you come and do a cultural competency training on these people so we can, know more and learn more and we can improve our services, right? Which can be a great goal. There's flaws with that, but it's a great goal. In comparison, cultural humility has as one goal to build an understanding of ourself, our personal culture, in order to improve our consciousness, to raise our consciousness. So in short, cultural competence, how we understand others; cultural humility, how we understand ourselves. You might also think of it as like the windows and mirrors curriculum. Cultural competence, how do I look through a window and learn like and see a different experience, something outside of myself. Cultural humility, how do I look into a mirror and see myself reflected, right? See my department, my organization reflected. So just to give you an example, cultural competency usually says something like, we want more people of color to be part of our team, or we want to know how to better retain our LGBTQ plus population, or tell us everything that we need to know about better serving our low income populations, because we never know who's going to come through the doors of our office, of our building, of our school, our organization, our healthcare facility. And we want to be ready. We want to be more inclusive. Cultural competence, right? Cultural humility would respond, you're never going to know all the things you need to know about all the people, but who are you when these communities express interest in joining your team or your department, right? Maybe we need to look more inward first instead of outward. If these populations aren't reflected on your team already, who are you when these populations engage with your services? What work have you done on your organizational culture before they arrive? What work have you done on yourself? Who are you is what cultural humility asks. And so that is largely the approach that we take, which can be a hard and painful journey, but it also can be really joyful and liberating. So a couple more things with our philosophy, again, as an example of like, what are some things that you might want to ask consultants that you're bringing in? We focus on building critical mass. So this is different from other consultants where, or just other organizations in general that might say like, we need everybody to like get on board, right? And I think that can be a great goal. But our philosophy is that we don't need everybody. We need critical mass, right? We're likely not going to get everyone to come along, and we can't afford to wait anymore. Some of us have been waiting for a long time, right? And so as people, maybe if you are in any leadership supervisory positions, we could be asking you, what is your role in coaching people up around these things? If these are indeed values that your organization has, or what are you doing to coach people out, right? If they are not contributing in this way. And again, like people, if people are open to learning and growing, that's great. And that's a different story. We're talking about the people that are dragging their feet, holding us back, are undermining these efforts, right? And we've seen organizations say like, well, we got to wait until everybody's ready. No, we don't, is our approach. And again, people might not agree with that. A couple more things. We are not a checkbox and we don't have a magic wand. And so we just like to state that out front. And so we ask organizations, do not use us as your checkbox. If that's what you are doing, like that is not what we are about. We won't be your people for this. And we also like can't make magic happen, right? This is a process and sometimes it's a long game. Lastly, we believe the advancement of equity requires bold collective leadership that puts values into action. And when we say leadership, it can mean many things, and we think leaders can exist at every level of an organization. But so bold collective leadership, putting values into action. So with that, we're going to dig into what that can look like, putting values into action. So we want to talk about like why you should drink the tea. Again, transformative equity analysis, right? Why engage in efforts like equity audits, culture and climate assessments, collective leadership, co-learning experiences, etc. And so in order to do this, we wanted to highlight a big reason for drinking the tea, if you will. And so we're going to ask you to participate in what I would describe as a low risk activity. It's challenge by choice, of course, but we would love for folks to participate if you feel willing. And we're just going to ask you if you're able to put a thumbs up or a thumbs down. A thumbs up if you agree. And so you can just do that in person with your hand, or a thumbs down if you disagree, or you can use the reactions tool on Zoom. Okay. And this is nobody's judging you. Well, I can't speak for everybody in this room. There might be some people judging you, but we're not trying to look at everybody's thumbs. This is just a self-reflection activity. And Laura and I can say, will not be judging you. So we're going to put up a statement on the screen, and we're going to just ask you if you agree or disagree. This is creating a binary, and I know folks aren't always comfortable with that, but we're going to push you to do one or the other, none of this sideways business, just to try to get a pulse, right? And we want you to, you might experience some tension, and that's all I'll say about this. Okay, so let us know if you have any questions. It's just going to be a quick, like, 3-second statement, and then we're going to keep moving forward. Here we go. I value honesty. So thumbs up if you agree, thumbs down if you disagree, and we want to see your thumbs, as many thumbs as possible. I value honesty.
These new Zoom graphics are wonderful.
Yeah, sometimes it just, if you do that, and then it brings it up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
I always tell the truth.
Let's see your thumbs.
Keyword being always.
I strive to learn and grow every day. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Agree or disagree? And we appreciate honest thumbs. Thank you.
I intentionally surround myself with people who challenge me.
Okay. Thank you for participating. We love to see the thumbs. I believe feedback is important. We got 2 thumbs up.
I consistently respond positively when I receive critique.
All right, we're maybe halfway through, so keep the thumbs coming. I value transparency. All right.
I'm open with my coworkers about my salary and income.
Okay. I view conflict as healthy.
I avoid talking politics with some people.
I desire racial justice.
My social circles are racially and ethnically diverse.
I put people over profit.
I never support entities that don't pay workers a living wage.
We have a collective responsibility to address hate, bias, and bigotry. And last one.
I always intervene when I witness or observe instances of racism, transphobia, ableism, etc. Okay, so, and for the purposes of our time together today, we don't have time for a full discussion, but just wanted to simply offer some fuel for ongoing reflection, give you a little bit of what, some of the types of conversations we encourage organizations and groups to have, but would love to hear some initial thoughts, though, in the chat. So feel free to share some responses in the chat to the following questions. Just how did that feel? What was hard about that? What felt easy about that? And why you think that might be? How do you observe this struggle play out in your current or past workplaces? Again, just encouraging the individual reflection as well as the organizational reflection with regard to group dynamics and organizational culture. So thinking about it on multiple levels. So if you feel like sharing some of your thoughts either directly to us or in the chat, always love to hear how people make meaning or are observing maybe some of that tension play out day to day or in your own lives. And wanted to kick it over to Amanda for just some other takeaways before we move along.
Yeah, so just really wanted to get to the internal impact of values in congruence. And we hope that this can be a starting point that elicits a larger conversation about organizational values, especially. So of course, there's individual values, but also organizational values, right? I heard Chow say at the beginning, right? Like these issues are systemic and like people make up systems. And so looking at both of those viewpoints. And if we are not regularly analyzing values alignment and misalignment, right, where you might have gaps in what you say you value and what your actions communicate, we call that the say-do gaps, right? Here's what I say, but here's what we do. Here's what we say as an organization, but here's what we're actually doing, those say-do gaps. If we are not analyzing that, we could be communicating this misalignment to employees, to community members, to other organizations, and that can fuel distrust. And it has. We hear many of those stories. It can fuel feelings of betrayal. And most importantly, there can be massive amounts of harm caused. And so really just like wanting us to look at the impacts both internally and externally when there is this incongruence. And in fact, this is, right, wanting to spill the tea a little bit. We don't have a lot of time to go through this fully, but this is one of the things when Laura and I have existed in organizations, but especially as we've supported organizations across industries, there are many, many patterns that come up over and over. And often regardless of like size and culture and geographic location, et cetera. And this is one of the big ones, is values incongruence. And so I wanted you to experience a little bit about that, because we're also not trying to simplify it, right? Like it can be really difficult to negotiate those things, right? And we can think like, yeah, I'm all about this, but like, what do our actions communicate? And people are watching, right? Or depending on you, especially if you're in a leadership position within your organization. So that's one thing that we want you to think about, values incongruence. Laura, were you going to say a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so assuming that people have do indeed have the values of equity, justice, fairness, collective care as something that they have at the center of their work, or even tangentially. A question that we like to ask partners to grapple with, and then go well beyond this, but are, who do you exist to serve, and who are you accountable to? And that may seem like a simple question, but kind of breaking that down into very different components can take a long time when it comes to how structurally these things are built in. So just wanted to give you some examples of the ways organizations have grappled with this too. So in my experience in a nonprofit organization, one of the ways that we talked about this, that was a really hard and messy conversation that we had with our entire staff, which I appreciated, but was brought into the space by our executive director. We had started a conversation about funders and alignment, and what were our potential non-negotiables for if funders were funding our work. We knew where our values lied and what we wanted to do, but where were funders getting their directives from? And were there certain lines we weren't willing to cross? And some people we had very different perspectives, but even having the conversation and being transparent about it with each other felt much better than just taking financial resources without critically analyzing how those things would impact how our constituents and people that we're serving are viewing us as well. Because as we know, generations that are coming up, and this was a youth serving organization, are analyzing things critically in a way that I hope are excited about, and have a lot of things to say about that and things that they demand from their work environments, which is something we'll mention later too, is that social justice is a huge factor for these upcoming generations that are going to be entering the workforce and have already started to, that are on their radar. So for example, if you're a youth serving agency or group or organization, how many youth seats do you have on your board of directors or an advisory board with actual teeth to make policy changes and have decision-making power? How are youth perspectives and input prioritized in strategic planning. When you're asking for references from people coming in to your organization, is one of them a reference from a young person in your community? These are actual ways, that people are incorporating these things, and that we've seen organizations improve their processes to center people most impacted by the work they're doing in the decision-making and leadership process. So these structural transformative changes that go beyond like representation without giving people meaningful, tangible ways to make changes. And so just wanted to share that question a little bit, and then share some other things that we have observed over the course of our time supporting organizations. And so won't have time to get too far into this, but wanted to talk about some of the ways that we've observed organizations maybe become stagnant or cause harm without meaning to, or sometimes just be comfortable in the structures that we exist in and not really want to change. And so we talked about the values and congruence, but being fear-centered, whether we think we are or not. Maybe we're afraid to make a bold statement because we don't want to have to navigate uncomfortable conversations or messiness. Inflexibility can mean just being afraid of change in general, or not being willing to try things. Dreaming and trying new things organizationally, I feel like we've had some of our most exciting partnerships with organizations that really put their trust in us and allow us to give creative ways of intervention, and then aren't afraid to try those things, knowing that things can always evolve and be improved, and that it's not the end all be all. So one example that comes to my mind is a nonprofit in our area that was updating their holiday policy. And so they were trying to transition, we suggested, to floating holidays, which they ended up implementing, went over really well with their staff. But then also adding the caveat in their employee handbook that this is an ongoing process. We'd love to continue to get input from staff at all levels to continue to improve on this policy, because then it is more of a shared leadership model. And that was another thing they were working on, flattening their hierarchy. So just a couple examples there. Amanda, did you want to jump in with anything?
No, but feel free to take a screenshot. And again, at the end, we will certainly invite folks to follow up with us if you want to talk further, because I know some of these bullet points might feel a little vague, but we've got stories and examples for all of them. And so happy to share. But just to piggyback off of what you said, Laura, right? The goal isn't to be perfect. Never. Like, that is not anything that we ever say. And so it is just being honest about where we are at in the journey. But first, like, that takes some critical self-reflection, organizational reflection to understand that, and then to own it and to make room for people to give that feedback. And so there are organizations who are like, well, we don't want to, how do we determine like holidays or this or that? Because then somebody's going to complain about this, right? And we do the best that we can, and we can explain the why. We invite people into the process, and we say, right, like, we're not always going to get it right, right? But here's the journey that we're on. We invite you to be on that with us, and here's how you can give that feedback. And we'll keep, always striving to do better. So I just wanted to amplify that point that you made. But again, happy to share more about any of these offline. We also have a slide that we won't be sharing today, but about like the affirming practices and patterns that we've observed across people in place.
Okay, so want to share a little bit about what transformative equity analysis can entail. And one of the things that we use with organizations is a resource created by the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, otherwise known as AORTA. And so just wanted to give you a glimpse into that, not so that you can read this because the words are very tiny, but we can send this resource afterwards. It's also easily available on their website, AORTA's website, and they're a worker-owned cooperative of facilitators and strategists devoted to helping movements renew a stronger sense of liberatory vision, values, and purpose. An organization that we look to for guidance and what they're doing. And so just wanted to share this, but it's a continuum of becoming a transformative anti-oppression organization. And so one thing that I loved that Chow had mentioned was this term radical. And I think that is a helpful concept to incorporate when we're looking at organizational transformation, that something that Angela Davis said, that radical simply means grasping things by the root, and that means structural change. That's not always easy. It's not quick. It's not superficial. And I think that's something that is embodied with the resource created by Aorta here when we're looking towards the goal of this. I think it's also helpful when it comes to transformative equity analysis to name that we very rarely see the two extremes of this chart. And so if you can't read those tiny words, which they're very tiny, on the far left side, it says exclusionary institution, and on the far right side, it says transformative institution. Rarely do we see these, because exclusionary institutions are likely actively avoiding collaborators like us, and on the reverse end, transformative institutions just don't exist en masse yet. So there are a few that come to mind in terms of true equitable models that are working. When we're seeing transformative organizations exist, it's usually moving, all throughout a year or its existence through a variety of these columns. But it's helpful to look at some of the descriptors under these to kind of get a feel for what are the goals. When we're trying to be a transformative organization, what are we trying to do? We're trying to move beyond tokenization, where we're focused on representation without a culture shift, to having a culture that is inclusive, true representation in leadership positions, flattening hierarchy to create co-leadership models, which again, we're seeing increase, but there aren't tons and tons of wonderful models yet. And so part of that is taking risks to try new things, seeing what works, and then continuing to improve those things. And so wanted to share a little bit, and again, this is just a helpful resource we wanted to share as something you can take away. But wanted to give you a little bit of insight into what analysis can look like, what it has looked like for other organizations. I'm going to ask Amanda to jump in to complement some of the things that I'm saying, because we've gotten to work with many different organizations, and I don't want to forget any of the big successes and wins that we've gotten to support. So part of that can look like programming review and reimagining, which is an exciting component. So that could look like helping to build out ERGs, employee resource groups, or affinity spaces, or peer support. Also, seeing that in a lot of the research on Gen Alpha in particular, peer feedback and support is something that they're seeing is an essential component to the success of that specific generation. Maybe that's finding and connecting equity leaders in a large organization. So that's something that we have supported in large school districts, is trying to find where, because, teachers and schools are underfunded, tapped out, at capacity, burned out. So how can we make sure we're sharing resources when we can, and what's working, but being those connectors again and weavers of bringing those folks together so that they can be, more efficient, tap into their collective wisdom, and then in turn be more sustainable in their efforts. This could also look like pilot and program development. So we had one client ask us, because one of our components in working with schools is trending towards restorative processes for engaging in and moving away from traditional disciplinary processes to support students. And so getting to pilot more arts-based healing programming for students that might be an alternative to traditional systems of punishment that may exist structurally in schooling. Also, policy review is a major component and something that we see requested often. So that could look like conflict and harm intervention, reviewing, improving, making suggestions, collaborating on evolving an employee handbook, hiring and retention, taking a look at hiring questions. What's the process like if we're an access-centered organization, and also with the convergence of access to healthcare, are we prioritizing neurotypicality, and are we not providing questions ahead of time when the components of who has access to a diagnosis, who wants to reveal certain statuses related to disability, can we just make the process more accessible in certain ways? And so that has been an area of holiday vacation, like I mentioned, dress code, disciplinary processes internally, conflict resolution that doesn't rely on disciplinary processes formally. And then also going into culture and values assessment. And so a lot of the ways that we do that are definitely tend to be more relational. And we're happy to provide recommendations for more formal quantitative processes, but our process tends to be more qualitative and relational. So community stakeholder dialogues are something we rely heavily on, having conversations with people, asking critical questions and getting to know people to learn a culture of a group, focus groups, climate surveys. But I wanted to kick it to Amanda to just expand on any of those components if you're feeling inclined to.
Sure. Yeah, a few things that I'll just say. The dress code, I think, and some of that has evolved a lot over time, but that's sometimes something that even as we're coming into organizations, we'll say like, let us see your dress code, because sometimes that really gives us some insight, right, of like where places might be at. And sometimes like these are things that like we created years ago, right, and haven't revisited. Hasn't evolved with the times. And so even just asking questions, right? And we have a list of like, we call it critical interrogation questions that helps us really pause and just think like, why do we do this, right? Or why do we do it this way? And who might this harm? And whose perspectives were left out of this decision. And so I was just working with an organization that was having an issue with dress code. And this was a student serving organization. And students were pushing back and questioning, critiquing the dress code, right? And like why some bodies were being policed differently than others. I mean, they were valid questions. And then I think sometimes instead of leaning in, people get defensive, and this can be some of the compromised resilience. I know there was a question about that, right? Of just like, instead of being able to we get defensive, egos might get in the way, whatever, like, and there's wisdom to be learned from that, from some of those critiques. And so I was talking with this particular person and was just like, well, what's the purpose of the dress code, right? Like, and so it was like, well, it's to keep people safe. Okay, so like, how does like this part of the dress code keep people safe, right? And just asking some questions, and it was a really great conversation. And some of it was just like, oh gosh, like I can see how I was putting my own values into this, because this is some of my experience that happened to me. And I thought this was keeping our young girls safe, when really like, maybe that has nothing to do with them, and it has everything to do with like how people are treating them. And so anyway, that is just something that I think there are like holidays, dress code there. These sometimes give us insight of where organizations might be at, and can yield some greater conversations. With climate surveys, there are many different climate surveys that consultants might do or specialize in. One that we have done is around hate, bias, and identity-based harm. And this also kind of goes back to when Laura was talking about conflict and harm intervention. And so there are many organizations that either have, like, if harm has happened, and harm can take many different forms, but here's this legal or formal rigid process, right, that you can go through that can be really scary for some folks. Or maybe it's like, well, the harm it didn't rise to that level, right? Or I don't want to go to the entity because I don't trust them, or I don't want to go because then the ball is out of my control. And so then what are my other options? And in many organizations, it's like nothing, right? So you can either do this really formal process, or you can do nothing. And that doesn't work for lots of people, right? And there's a lot of harm across the spectrum that happens in between doing nothing and like, doing something really a formal grievance or whatnot. And so some of this, like hate and bias, or people call it different things, but like creating a mechanism, a process, a team that are skilled and being able to respond to conflict and harm, especially identity-based conflict and harm that happens in every organization and school and business where people are involved. That gives people a place to feel heard and to get validated and to find support. And it isn't punishment centered. It isn't discipline centered, right? Those processes often already exist, but where are the processes to support people from a social justice standpoint, from being able to facilitate healing, right? And sometimes we jump to action, like, let's just fix it or change it, or we'll, suspend this person or fire this person or whatever it may be. And that might help a little, but that doesn't, if it's not changing the culture, right? Or if it's not facilitating healing, then there still are those wounds. And so there are many processes that we've done in regards to that, whether it's a team, it's a reporting mechanism, it's changing the culture. And one story I'll just share is with a school that was trying to better understand the hate and bias activity that was happening in their school. And they had a process already, an online process for reporting, but they're like, here's what we've gotten over a few years. And it was just like 3 things. And I was like, I can guarantee you that there's more than that happening. And so we did shared our survey with their teachers, staff, students from 3rd grade to 12th grade, and had them respond. We had an incredible response rate with one particular school district, 72% overall. Typically like 30% can be a great response rate. Within the elementary school within that district, 94% response rate. And they had so many stories to share. And one of the things that we heard was that the process that they had at their school, which was called Stop It, it was being utilized maybe 2% of the stories. It was like 2.01% of the stories were being funneled through that. Maybe 8% were actually being shared with adults in the school, and the rest were completely unknown to the district. And so it's really hard to make change when you don't know what is happening. And so we're in the process of helping them reimagine their process, and also holistically, beyond just a report and a team, but like, what can that look like holistically? So that is one example that I wanted to share. And the other one with community stakeholder dialogues, this is one of our favorite efforts to do when we have long-term partnerships, to be able to build relationships, understand people in place from internal people's perspectives. And so it's spending time doing one-on-one conversations with whoever key stakeholders may be. And then typically, right, looking, learning, listening for patterns that are emerging. And so again, it's a way to amplify voices from within, because we're external folks. And how do we make sure that we are making sure those are heard, but then also can turn that into action? And so with another organization currently, we completed a report, a summary report on all of these stakeholder dialogues, and we're able to turn it into a list of themes that had emerged with recommendations, and now it is being turned into a strategic plan for diversity, equity, inclusion, which they did not have before. They had no direction. That was one of the things that came up. They were wanting to do the work, but just so overwhelmed about where to begin. And so now there's some direction. So I just wanted to give you a couple examples about that. We have so many more, but wanted to leave you with some final thoughts as well, and then see if there's any time for questions. But before I advance, Laura, did I miss anything?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. And you mentioned environmental scans. We have done, can do website, social media, right? Even just like accessibility of like language, or even just sometimes when we're looking at policies, just changing policies so language isn't so gendered, right? And those, again, like little things, but maybe you don't have the time to like be looking through those. So lots of ideas there. What we want to leave you with are just some of these final thoughts. So the first one, if you're not ready around like DEI efforts, we strongly encourage you to get ready, right? And for many reasons, but one of them being something Laura mentioned a couple of times, is that if you don't have these folks in your organizations already pushing, asking the hard questions, right? Like, that is unfortunate, because that is some of how we grow and do better. But if you don't have them, they are coming. And so we're paying attention to both Gen Z and Gen Alpha, more socially aware. They want to work for organizations that align with their values and do something that benefits society. Gen Z is the most ethnically and racially diverse generation yet, with just half of Gen Zers identifying as an ethnic or racial minority. Gen Z candidates say that a company's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion is essential when choosing an employer. And that's not even getting to Generation Alpha, right? Which is going to be the most diverse. It'll be a majority minority, quote unquote, generation, the most inclusive generation, they have been called. The first of their generation will be entering the workforce around the year 2030. So soon. They are more direct, more technologically advanced, more socially aware, right? Like to be proactive and to be ready, right? Like we'll attract and keep these folks. And it also is better than having to like change because of like a reactionary response, right? That usually doesn't go over very well. The second thing we want to say is that a healthy culture of feedback is necessary. So if you want the tea, right? If you want to drink the tea, if you want to engage in some of these efforts in whatever way you need to engage, you have to be building or willing to build a culture of feedback. And that might seem silly or not that big of a deal. I can't tell you how many times we run into people who have a hard time responding to or receiving feedback. Even when we've been asked to come in and give feedback, please tell us, right, where our gaps are and what we're doing wrong. And then we tell them and they're like, oh, wait a minute, we didn't really want, that feedback, or we only want feedback so long as it makes us feel comfortable or so long as it doesn't require us to change, right? That is not a healthy culture of feedback. So I would say don't ask for this feedback under the big umbrella of T.E.A. Don't ask for feedback if you don't really want it as an organization. Don't ask for feedback if you're not going to do anything with it or about it, because you're just going to set yourself back even farther. So if there's work to be done to get ready first, then do that work and then engage in some of this transformative equity analysis. Let's see, commitment requires resources. So there is a budget needed for this, right? This is labor and people should be compensated for doing this work. And so consultants, right, are not typically free. But I also just want to say there are people in your organizations already, I'm sure, doing some of this work. How do we compensate them for this labor, right? Because it is often invisible labor that we just expect people to do for free. And so I just want you to know that like this commitment, it requires resources and not just money, but money is a big thing that delays progress. And so how are you budgeting for this? And again, one way is to like, let's start small and bring in a consultant and then we can build from there. Maybe we need a position, a full-time position, a team, right? And that's a 5-year plan. When you're looking for these folks, please make sure that you are valuing lived experience and identity, right? People who are conscious of these things, that is really valuable and what is sometimes lacking in organizations. And so how do you make sure you're looking for that within your consultants? And so, for example, if your organization is all straight white men, it can be helpful to have a straight white man who's a consultant because maybe there is that like understanding. It also can be harmful and maybe missing, right? Maybe this is a place where we can bring in some new perspectives based on lived experience and identity. Please don't underestimate the importance of praxis. So a commitment to large DEI initiatives as part of a reaction to political or social events without investing in internal organizational assessment or without understanding internal disparities within organizations and how it plays out, plays a part in community-wide disparities, right? That can be problematic. And so how are we engaging in practices that are consistent with our values? Not to perfection, not that we're always going to get it right, but how are we practicing this? Make sure community engagement and solidarity is a huge part of this. So communicating with our BIPOC communities, other marginalized communities within your area, being proactive instead of reactive. This can ensure consistency, right? And because there is a need to be consistent. And so if you're like, we need these voices, but we've done nothing to build relationships, right? That can feel very tokenizing. And so we need to be engaging in that community-wide solidarity. And then lastly, this is a holistic approach. So we're just talking about one piece of this, right? Which is DEI assessment in short, just one part of a fuller journey. But it's a great place to start. If you haven't done some of the work or if you're getting stuck, right, and need an outside perspective, but it can't stop there. It's just, in many places, it's the beginning. So what we would encourage you to do is look at similarly situated organizations. Who are they using if they're doing any of this work? What has worked for them? And also what I'll put up on the screen is that this is a genuine invitation. Feel free to take a screenshot or I'll try to put it in the chat. You can email myself or Laura if you have follow-up questions, or if you're like, we want to do some of these audits, but we don't know where to begin. We could suggest people, right? If we're not your people, we have lists of people that we would highly recommend, especially based on industry or location. And so, thank you for putting that in the chat, Laura. So feel free to reach out to us. But with that, I'm out of time, so I'm going to hand it back over to Chow. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you so much, Amanda and Laura, for all of that information. We will have a recording of the session as well as the slides that go along with it. For those of you who put questions in the chat, we'll share those with Laura and Amanda and make sure to include them in the response that we send back to everyone so that you can have an opportunity to have your questions answered. But I just want to express my sincere gratitude for this session and for the idea of reflecting inward before setting expectations that are outward to our community. So how, as organizations, do we model our own self-reflection, implement things within our own organizations that would be transformational for our communities, and particularly for those that might hold a marginalized identity that live amongst us, right? And how can they participate in building a community that truly reflects their values, their needs, and their wants? And so with that, I will wish you a great afternoon, hopefully a cool one, and remind you that on September 27th, we will have episode 3 of this equity series. And we are really excited and fortunate and grateful to live in a community of folks that can join us for these learning opportunities. Have a good afternoon.